Hey, welcome back. Business 150, Introduction to Management. Now we are on video number 3 in our module number 9 on human resource management. And I am going to be talking about recruiting, and therefore I got my recruiting hat on. I guess. But as you can see from the title slide, what we're looking at in this video is recruiting and hiring. We have looked at in the first couple of videos, right, that we are in HR all about trying to forecast and then fill future employment needs, and therefore it's time to recruit, find some likely applicants and candidates, qualify them, interview them, and select and hire someone to fill our HR needs. So we hope that at the end of this video you'll be able to specify how organizations recruit new employees and explain how companies use all sorts of tools like application forms, interviews, and tests in selecting new employees. So let's talk about recruiting. What is recruiting? It's the process of attracting potential new employees to the organization. Now, it can be as easy, as you see here in the photo on the right, as putting a help wanted sign in the big front window of your store. But typically these days, you want to be able to reach out to a much wider swath of potential candidates than just the folks who happen to be in proximity to observe the sign you've taped in the window. Because recruiting, you see, serves 3 purposes. You can see there on the slide. Recruiting provides enough applicants from which to select future employees. Recruiting seeks to attract at least minimally qualified applicants, and especially in these days, recruiting seeks to attract a demographically and culturally diverse applicant pool. So you can see why just hanging a small sign in the window may or may not be the best way to reach the right pool of future applicants in this technologically advanced time. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this. The company controls 3 ways of fulfilling these purposes of recruiting. The company controls the sources through which potential applicants are contacted. Are they folks who are at least already conversant with internet technology? Are they folks who are primarily have already worked in the industry and are familiar with job practices common to the industry? Or do they simply happen to be folks who are regionally and geographically in the same neighborhood? The company also controls the information that is given to applicants, how much of the job description is given up front, how much of the requirements and KSAs necessary is divulged up front. How do you describe your own company and what you're about and your purposes? How do you describe the role and the requirements for the role and what this job really looks like? And finally, the company controls the contacts between the applicants and the company. How frequently and how quickly will you get back to applicants? How many interviews will it take? What's the nature of the screening and candidating process? How much does certain candidates see of the company and an experience of what it's really like to work there? All those kinds of things, right? That's how the company controls its side of the recruiting process. So recruiting seeks to get to the selection process. Selection is the process of collecting systematic information about applicants and using that information to decide which applicants to hire. There's a whole set of tools to collect systematic information about applicants. There's application forms, there's a series of interviews, and nowadays, for many employers, the series is getting longer and longer, right? There are tests that ideally should be designed so they employ questions that gather information that directly and substantially relates to the job. So many times it has been in vogue to ask folks about personality and tendencies and character. And quite frankly, these days with some of the legal landmarks and benchmarks in place that constrain hiring practices, well, HR professionals need to be very careful about how they construct these kinds of tests. And again, the best practice is that any of these tools used to screen and select candidates should gather information directly and substantially related to the available job. You can see here in illustration from the textbook we borrowed, figure 9.1, just an illustration of the employee selection process. It starts at the bottom by getting interest in getting completed applications. Completed applications from interested parties would then result in interview candidates. At some point in the process, you may or may not decide to check references. More on that in a couple of slides. And finally, with the pool of applicants that you've narrowed down to, making a final selection. So let's talk about the employment application. Most of us of a certain age and older have filled in a paper job application. And the problem with paper job applications is that they've typically been too short, at least too short where they need to be longer, which is to really help you to get to know the applicant and what they can do, what value they can add to your organization. Sure, they're long with all the standard boilerplate stuff, middle name, social security number, past 18 addresses of their life, and those kinds of things. But the real information you really want, what can they do in this role for your organization? The traditional paper application has really scarce amount of space. And therefore, it's been easier for companies to use online applications that can more easily gather more information and more information where it counts. In addition, you see there the third bullet point, a training and experience form is sometimes an application addendum or a device that presents a small number of the important tasks of a job and then screens applicants whether they have ever performed or been trained in those kinds of activities. In some types of industries and in job roles, you'll find that as a tool that's used with some applications. Sometimes those kinds of training and experience forms take the place of an actual demonstration that you may perform on site if you make it to that point in the interview process. All of that's part of the application, and the next step is from the stack of applications that you'll receive is figuring out who you actually want to invite in to interview. This is perhaps the most often used selection device. You can see in the bullet point there. The interview allows at least one member of the organization, and nowadays best practice is probably far more than one, to interact with each applicant and assess the applicant's job-related KSAs. KSA, again, an acronym for knowledge, skills, and abilities which are related to the job at hand. Most interviews at some point along the way, there will be a one-on-one interview, but many interviews, especially at the initial stages, take place with 2, 3, or more representatives of the company so that many eyes can get different perspectives on a potential candidate's responses. 2 aspects of the interview format are especially important. One is the structure of the interview, meaning that the interviewer or interviewers should ask the same set of job-related questions of each and every candidate. This helps to prevent bias. This helps to get an objective picture of each candidate, at least with regards to those set of necessary questions. And that brings up the second point, the nature of the questions themselves. The questions themselves should be all about job-related behaviors, and then allowing the candidate to speak for themselves and share a little bit about themselves, who they are personally, what they're looking for in terms of a corporate culture, their values, and those kinds of things, right? But the questions should very much focus upon job-related behaviors and prerequisites. Here is a set reproduced from the textbook. You can see here table 9.2 for potential behavior-based interview questions that might work out depending on the type of role that you are interviewing for. Just the kinds of things, and of course there are lists abound on the internet of example interview questions, the kinds of things if you're applying for a job that you should be up to speed and ready for, and then some ideas of what you might find useful if you are in HR looking to interview candidates. Another tool is the test, some sort of objective test that you have candidates complete in order to get a better idea of their qualifications, and you see several different types of tests there. Ability tests, measuring an applicant's knowledge of specific work content or cognitive ability. This is very, very common with programming, software programming jobs, of course, having ability, intelligence, and cognitive tests. There's also performance or work sample tests to verify a particular applicant's ability to actually perform on the job. And when I was interviewed with College of Marin, they had me come in and give a 30-minute teaching example to an actual classroom. I actually had to teach on a particular prescribed topic for 30 minutes, and then the students in the class would weigh in at the end on all of the candidates who were invited in to give a teaching example. There are assessment center tests to simulate managerial tests. There are integrity tests to measure an applicant's attitudes, opinions about corporate dysfunctional behaviors. There are personality inventories to determine the person's pattern of interaction with the individual and other interpersonal relationships. And finally, for some tests that require physical activity, there may be a physical exam to qualify an individual's placement in manually and physically demanding jobs. This is by no means a comprehensive list either, right? This is just a representative set of 6 types of tests that may be given depending on the role at hand. Now we can talk a little bit about reference checks. Typically, you are asked to give anywhere from 1 to 3 personal references who might be able to speak to your character and your qualifications to fulfill a particular job. And you can see here, reference checks can be handled by contacting previous supervisors, checking online networking sites, etc. But notice the second bullet point. There is very little statistical evidence to support the use of checking references in selection. Why is that? Well, when you are asking someone to give references, many times you're not exactly getting what the reference is intended. In other words, when you ask for someone to provide references, you're presuming whoever is provided as a reference has actually seen this person at work, can verify they have the track record and history and acumen to perform the job, and can provide some objective data and subjective anecdotal experience with the candidate. And the key word there is you're hoping for objective. But quite frankly, if your applicant, if your candidate is providing that name and reference, it more typically is not necessarily because they know them in the job, but because they can speak well of the person. That's why you put that person on as a reference rather than someone else who you're currently having an argument with, right? Not only that, because you may not be getting the best, clearest, most objective information, but also there are legal risks. What if someone is listed as a reference and then they say some really, really bad things about the candidate, which are, quite frankly, unsubstantiated, it's just hearsay, right? Then you may run into some legal issues. And because of the risks involved with checking references or searching online, many HR departments will only verify factual data of employment when contacting a reference, and being very reserved and careful about any other types of questions you may end up asking. Here are, reproduced from the textbook, some steps for checking employee references. These are, you'll notice number 7, keep all questions work-related. Do not ask any questions that could potentially lead to a discrimination lawsuit, including race, marital status, health conditions, and religious affiliations. Got to be careful, and in fact, we have a video later on in this module about some of the legal constraints on HR management, and this is one of the things you have to be very, very careful with. So, we hope that's been helpful in introducing you to how organizations recruit new employees and how companies use this process for applications, interviews, candidating, and finally the selection of new employees. More on this, in fact, some really good information in the textbook on this topic. I invite you to take a look at that and wrap your arms around this very important process that most of us will have some experience with on either side, either as a hiring representative in management or as a candidate applying for a job at an employer. Hope that's helpful. We'll see you in the next video.